You're dead asleep. A coastal breeze is drifting through the screen window, and it's cool and so inviting. It's August 2005 in Cape Elizabeth, Maine, a town that is so safe that locking your front door feels like a personal insult to your neighbors. But tonight, something wakes you up. You hear a subtle creak in your floorboards, and there's a shadow in your room. You wake up, expecting to see your dog, or maybe it's your partner getting up for a glass of water. Instead, there's a stranger standing at the edge of your bed. He isn't reaching for your jewelry box. He doesn't have a weapon. He's just perfectly still, standing over you, watching you sleep. And the second you pull in a breath to scream, he turns and vanishes into the dark. This wasn't a one-off nightmare. Throughout the late summer of 2005, this quiet Maine community was paralyzed by an intruder. He entered homes through unlocked doors and windows, and he had no interest in stealing anything. He just wanted to sit there and watch people as they entered their REM cycles. Today, we're diving into the bizarre unsolved case of the Cape Elizabeth Sleepwatcher. Let's get spooky. Hey, spooky people. It's your best friend, Kenny. In the summer of 2005, the historically safe community of Cape Elizabeth, Maine, had an unidentified male that would be known in local lore as the Cape Intruder or the Sleepwatcher. He repeatedly entered private homes in the dead of the night for the sole purpose of standing over people and watching them sleep. This is a weird, modern true crime story from New England, and it doesn't have any of the traditional hallmarks of your typical break-in. There's no forced entry, there's nothing stolen, there's no physical assaults, but the crimes obviously freaked people out. Cape Elizabeth is a desirable picturesque coastal town in Cumberland County in southern Maine. It's known for rocky beaches, beautiful coastlines, and the iconic Portland Headlight, which is a historic lighthouse. The town is a wealthy, tight-knit community, has top-notch schools, and an exceptionally high quality of life. According to census data, the town has about 9,600 people. Historically, many of the homes are in the older section of the town, and these were built as residential retreats for businessmen commuting to Portland by trolley. So the lots in these neighborhoods are small and situated very close together. This density allows an intruder to easily slip from the shadows from one backyard directly into the next without having to walk through wide open spaces exposed. In 2005, Maine was recognized as one of the safest states in the nation. The Maine State Police Uniform Crime Reporting Division documented a statewide crime index of just 25.36 offenses per 1,000 persons. Violent crime in Maine is very rare, occurring at a rate of only 1.13 offenses per 1,000 persons. Property crimes like burglary, theft, stealing cars is the vast majority of all crimes in the area. And Cumberland County, and specifically Cape Elizabeth, had even lower crime rates than the average areas in Maine. Cape Elizabeth was an idyllic bubble where residents left their front doors unlocked, ground floor windows open to catch some breeze, and the Cape Intruder would exploit this trust. The Cape Intruder operated for approximately about 7 months, beginning in the late summer 2005 and stopping in the late winter of 2006. However, the lore suggests that perhaps the Sleepwatcher was involved longer, with there being a cluster of similar reports spanning from 2007 and unconfirmed tellings of similar situations up to 2015 before stopping completely. Unlike traditional burglars who are trying to get money, or home invasion robbers who use violence and intimidation to subdue their victims, the Cape Intruder's role was voyeuristic. There was never any evidence of forced entry, no windows were ever broken, no hinges were pried, and no locks were picked. The intruder relied entirely on the fact that the town left their doors unlocked or their windows open, slipping silently into homes under the cover of night. The lack of evidence made investigators think that the perpetrator might have had keys, or that he stalked the residences for days to memorize the residents' habits and vulnerabilities. A significant number of the break-ins were in the Mitchell Road area, which is a residential road characterized by these close together homes. Other nearby streets like Shore Road and Fowler Road also had heightened reports of these types of suspicious events. Once inside the home, the intruder would navigate these homes in a very stealthy way, locating the bedrooms. He preferred to stalk women, although entire families, including their spouses, were sometimes present in the home at the time when these things happened. When he entered the bedroom, the intruder would not rummage through drawers, he didn't steal jewelry or electronics or look for cash, and he never touched or assaulted the victims. He would only stand in the room and watch the victims sleep. Victims' accounts would detail him standing directly over the bed, crouching near the headboard, standing in the doorway, or sitting quietly at the foot of the bed. Victims would be subconsciously alerted by the subtle sounds of breathing or maybe noises in the floorboards, or just the instinct that detects another being was watching you, and the victims would wake up. Victims would report the jarring experience of opening their eyes to find a strange man standing over them, silently staring down into their faces. And the intruder's reaction to being discovered was the same. Once he realized the victim was awake, the voyeurism was over, he would immediately leave, turning and sprinting out of the room, through the house and out the door before the victim could fully process what was going on, scream for help, or attack him. The Cape Intruder's actions fit into a specific category of paraphilic behavior known as voyeurism, and it had a little twist in that he had a thrill with the home invasion. Criminologists and behavior profilers state that break-ins where nothing is stolen or damaged are linked to a perpetrator's need for power, control, and deriving sexual pleasure from looking. And normally this type of behavior is considered something that happens before an escalation, right? Psychologists frequently draw parallels between the Cape Intruder and early rehearsal phases of notorious killers. The Manson family infamously utilized a tactic that they would call creepy crawling, which involved breaking into homes where the occupants slept simply to move furniture around, proving to themselves that they could enter these houses and exhibit dominance over sleeping people. One of the most prolific serial killers in American history, the Golden State Killer, began his criminal career under the moniker of the Visalia Ransacker. And during this initial phase, he worked in this small California city, breaking into homes, rearranging items, laying out clothing, and occasionally standing over sleeping victims without assaulting them. This behavior allows this person to test how stealthy they can be, experience the adrenaline rush of a home invasion, and exercise the godlike power over an unaware, vulnerable victim. What makes the Cape Elizabeth case different is that the escalation, turning the voyeurism into an essay or a murder that usually follows after this type of period of home invasions, never happened. The intruder watched, left, and vanished, obviously leaving behind psychological trauma for the victims and the community as they waited for the other shoe to drop. The Cape Elizabeth police responded swiftly, but the investigations were hamstrung by the nature of these crimes. The investigation faced hurdles due to the lack of any physical evidence. Because the intruder didn't use forced entry, there were no tool marks, there was no broken glass or paint transfers to analyze. Because he didn't steal anything, there was no stolen property to track through pawn shops. The intruder was remarkably lucky with trace evidence. Investigators were unable to ever recover viable fingerprints, footprints, or DNA at the scenes of the crime. The police were left entirely on the groggy eyewitness testimonies of victims who had only seen the suspect for a few seconds in low light after waking up from sleeping. And despite this, only seeing this person after a adrenaline-fueled panic awaking and seeing this man, they were able to come up with a profile of his physical appearance. Victims described him as a Caucasian male in his early 20s. He was between 5'8" and 6 feet tall with an average build and dark hair. He was described as wearing dark clothing, usually a dark baggy hoodie to obscure his features and blend into the shadows. In late 2003, the police collaborated with a sketch artist to produce a composite drawing of the Cape Intruder, which would be published in local newspapers, and the release of the sketch achieved its goal. It triggered an immediate influx of tips from an anxious public. The department received at least 10 highly specific tips from residents who believed they recognized the man in the drawing and requested that officers investigate those individuals. Of these tips received by the police, one tip stood out as promising. 2 independent individuals contacted the police and provided the exact same name of a young local man that they believed was the prowler. The police followed up on these leads, stating everybody seems to think it looks like somebody they know or have seen. However, the investigation hit a wall. In the American legal system, a tip from the public doesn't mean that you have probable cause to arrest or get a search warrant, especially when the crimes have absolutely no physical evidence. So without fingerprints placing this guy inside the victim's home, without a confession, without any other sort of physical evidence or catching him in the act, the police were paralyzed. The leads never came to fruition, and the local suspect was never named, arrested, or charged with any of the crimes. The impact of the Cape Intruder extended far beyond immediate victims. It really affected the peace of mind of the entire town. This community had prided itself as an open, trusting community, and it suddenly found itself barricading its doors. In response to this terror, the residents mobilized. A dedicated neighborhood watch group was established to counter the threat of the Sleepwatcher in the Mitchell Road area. Community meetings would happen in local halls and attended by frightened residents and local law enforcement. And during these meetings, the police would encourage vigilance, asking the community to work together. The more eyes and ears out there, the better. Residents would report that they would sleep with one eye open. So the Cape Intruder had altered the behavior of the town. Cape Elizabeth wasn't this sanctuary anymore where people could leave their front door unbolted. It became a community that was changed by the knowledge that a predator had walked silently through their hallways. And because the Cape Elizabeth Intruder was never identified or arrested, the fact that there was never an official resolution has been filled by speculation, investigative analysts, and true crime researchers, and people on the internet. There are several theories that have been discussed as to who could be responsible. A name that comes up a lot after deep dives in Maine criminal records is Douglas DeWalt. DeWalt was a known criminal in Maine. DeWalt confessed to quietly entering homes simply to watch people. Proponents of this theory argue that DeWalt's behavior matched what happened in Cape Elizabeth. However, a closer examination of the legal records shows some doubt. Court records have his most prominent offenses in Skowhegan, Maine, and Skowhegan is nearly 2 hours north of Cape Elizabeth. The problem with DeWalt is there's a massive timeline discrepancy, and the Cape Elizabeth Police Department never acknowledged DeWalt's involvement. One of the most heavily debated parallels to the Cape Intruder is the case of the Halifax Sleepwatcher. 3 years after the official end of the Maine intrusions, a similar series of crimes began occurring in the south end of Halifax in Nova Scotia, which is about an 8-hour drive from Cape Elizabeth. Between 2008 and 2011, more than a dozen residents, mostly young women, reported waking up to find a man in their bedrooms. The Halifax intruder's MO was the same as the Cape intruders. He entered quietly, he did not steal valuables, he did not assault the victims, he crouched and stood over the beds and stared with deep-set eyes and an open mouth, and quickly exited the room the moment the victim screamed or woke up. In one case, a 22-year-old victim testified that she woke to find a man crouched down in her bedroom, stating she saw deep-set eyes staring at her and that his mouth was open before he silently left. The trauma was so severe for her that she left her house weeks later, which is understandable. In September 2011, Halifax police arrested a man named Barry Edward Sinclair, who was arrested only an hour after a victim reported a man in her room. Police had been looking for a suspect in an orange hoodie, though Sinclair was arrested wearing a dark baggy hoodie and sweating profusely and looking confused. Sinclair would eventually be acquitted for the voyeurism charges related to the Halifax Sleepwatcher, because the victims were unable to positively identify him. But he was found guilty of a separate break-in and sentenced to 5 years in prison in February 2013. There would be a psychological evaluation of Sinclair by the Parole Board of Canada, and it gave a strange glimpse into the mind of a voyeuristic intruder. Parole documents state that most of Sinclair's crimes were entering the homes of randomly selected women, observing them until being discovered, and getting some kind of reaction from them, and then leaving. The board would note that Sinclair had a criminal pattern that has little regard for the safety of others, and that his offenses were highly intrusive and were likely to escalate into more dangerous things. They also said that he had an indifference regarding the harm that he caused his victims. Sinclair was deemed an untreated intruder who refused programming and was classified as a high risk to re-offend in a sexual manner. And Sinclair had a criminal history that included breaking and entering, SA, and trespassing at night dating back to 1980. There are issues with linking Sinclair's case to the Cape Elizabeth Intruder, though. Sinclair was 49 at the time of his arrest in 2011 in Halifax, meaning he would have been roughly 43 years old during the 2005 Cape Elizabeth intrusions. The Cape Intruder was described by multiple Maine victims as a man in his early 20s. And of course, it's possible that panic and the dark conditions could be the reason why his age was misjudged. 2-decade discrepancy is quite a bit. There's also no verified public or legal record placing Sinclair in Maine in 2005. After he was released from prison in 2017, Sinclair relocated to St. John's, Newfoundland. A controversial theory, but a theory that I find fascinating, is that the Cape Intruder was the result of a sociological phenomenon combined with parasomnia known as sleep paralysis. Sleep paralysis is a well-documented medical condition that occurs when a person awakes during the REM stage of sleep, where they find themselves consciously awake but unable to move or speak. This state usually comes with hallucinations, vivid, terrifying, waking dreams where the sufferer perceives dark, malevolent figures, often described as a shadow man or an intruder, standing over their bed, lingering in the doorway, or sitting in the closet. Some of you who like to take Benadryl might know the Hat Man. People who believe in this theory believe that there were initial valid reports of someone breaking into their home and watching them, and that after the media fury, the town of Cape Elizabeth was primed for panic. So the widespread fear of a sleepwatcher breaking into homes could have seeped into the collective self-conscious of the residents, and that individuals experiencing completely mundane episodes of sleep paralysis may have hallucinated the image of the sketched intruder into their bedrooms, which turned a medical anomaly into a physical threat. Now, maybe hallucinations can explain some of the unverified reports that happened after the initial panic, but this theory doesn't account for all of the case. In many of the core Cape Elizabeth cases, residents woke up to find physical, undeniable evidence of an intrusion. Doors were found wide open. Lights were turned on in the middle of the night. Further, the victims were able to provide descriptions of the suspect fleeing the scene, which would be an action that would break the sleep paralysis hallucination. So I think it's most likely that the Cape Intruder was a real person, though this mass hysteria may have inflated his legend. As of today, the true identity of the 2005 Cape Elizabeth Sleepwatcher is an unsolved mystery. By 2006, the wave of terror had evaporated into the cold Maine winter, leaving behind a baffled police department and a traumatized community. There would be sporadic, unconfirmed reports occasionally over the next decade, with a final incident occurring around midnight in 2015. But nothing matched the intensity of the 2005 cluster of intrusions. And despite following leads and using sketches, collaborating with neighborhood watch groups, and collecting tips from the public, authorities were never able to arrest the suspect. Whether the perpetrator was an unnamed local man in his 20s who managed to evade detection, or some sort of transient voyeur operating across borders, or just an entirely unknown entity who died or was arrested for other crimes, or just simply decided to stop, the mystery remains. The legacy of the Cape Intruder is an aspect of the community's lore, and it permanently altered the community's visions of safety. He exploited the trust of the safe, wealthy town, turning the peaceful isolation of Cape Elizabeth into a psychological trap. Today, long after the panic, people who live in this area still lock their door. The chilling lore of a man who broke in just to watch them sleep continues to haunt this town. A reminder that the darkest terrors are not always violent, but are sometimes just silent observation in the dark. Please subscribe to this channel, The Spooky Lawyer. Please like and share this video. If you'd like to support this channel, you can become a member. I would appreciate that. You could also support this channel by continuing to watch, share, and like my videos. Commenting helps, and hitting the hype button. And I do really appreciate you watching my videos. And please stay spooky.